Well, okay. In the means of being punctual, I think we'll begin. So I would like to welcome the people who are attending today and also the people on the panel. Thank you for coming. My name's Kate Wright and I'm the CEO of CASA CV based here in Bendigo, so the Centre Against Sexual Assault, Central Victoria. What I would first like to do is acknowledge that I am here today on Jara country with our collective services spanning lands belonging to the traditional owners of Dja Dja Wurrung, Tongarong, Yorta Yorta and Wiradjuri peoples. We pay our respects to leaders and elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories and the traditions, the culture and the hopes of all. We acknowledge the strengths and resilience of all people, their strong living culture and the unique role they play in the life of this region. We are sorry for the ongoing impact of colonisation and support self-determination and justice. Sovereignty has never been ceded. We remember that the land on which we stand was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also acknowledge today all survivors of sexual harassment, assault, abuse and family violence, particularly those who have lost their lives. For those who have survived, we acknowledge your ongoing resilience, strength and determination. So we do have closed captions as well, and you'll see now a comment in chat about how to access those. So this conversation is presented by the Loddon Gender Equality and Violence Prevention Consortium as part of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, a global campaign of action. The consortium is made up of CASA CV, the Centre for Non-Violence, Annie North Women's Refuge, Women's Health Loddon Mallee and Sunbury Cobor Community Health. The consortium works collaboratively together towards ending all forms of violence against women and children and is informed by human rights principles, gender equality and social justice. The overarching aim of the work we do is to ensure the safety of women and children and holding perpetrators to account. We work along the continuum of violence against women and children, from prevention through to tertiary responses. So this session is designed really to support teachers and professionals working with young people to strengthen knowledge, education and program development, and also to support local activism. It's a 90-minute session and includes presentations from all of the consortium partners, followed by a panel question and answer and shared discussion. It is really important to note that today we will be talking about violence against women, including sexual assault. If you need support, please contact any of the services that are now being put into the chat. And also all of the agencies as part of the consortium will have phone numbers and how to seek support on their Facebook pages and websites. So welcome, strap in, and first we'll begin by setting the scene. And I'd like to introduce MARGARET AUGERINOS, pronoun she, her. MARGARET is a qualified social worker who has been working in the not-for-profit community sector for the last 34 years. MARGARET is presently the Chief Executive Officer of the Centre for Non-Violence based in Bendigo, which delivers the full range of programs for women and children who experience domestic violence, including crisis response, therapeutic and recovery programs, as well as programs for men who use violence towards family members. MARGARET has presented at many conferences nationally and internationally and has presented at side and parallel events at a number of sessions of the United Nations Committee for the Status of Women. MARGARET is a passionate supporter of human rights and in ending gender-based violence against women. MARGARET will be discussing the gender drivers and dominant norms that contribute to violence against women and girls.
Thanks, Kate. And I've just turned my camera off because, as luck would have it, my internet has decided it's going to be unstable. So I'm just going to share my screen. Kate, just give me a nod if you can see my PowerPoint in front. Yeah, Fantastic. So thank you, everyone. And also my photo is a little bit better presented than I currently look today. I'm terribly sorry. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the country of the Dja Dja Wurrung. So today we're talking consent, and really to help provide context to what we're talking about and to understand it a little bit better, I'm going to really talk about why does violence against women occur? So what's sort of the overarching frameworks and approaches that are accepted internationally based on universal evidence? So if we're to prevent violence from occurring, we really do need to understand what these drivers are. And what I'll present over the next couple of slides is a little bit about the prevalence of violence and statistics, and they'll indicate why this is really a particularly gendered issue and why issues of consent are absolutely critical to helping to eliminate violence against women. So violence against women really is a problem of epidemic proportions in Australia. It's both a serious violation of women's human rights and extremely costly to society. So you can see what some of the statistics are there: $323 billion cost to the Australian economy by 2044, 2045. Violence against women, which is overwhelmingly perpetrated by men, is both a symptom and a cause of gender inequality and also a barrier to its achievement. However, this violence isn't inevitable, but rather is the product of social, cultural, political, and economic factors, conditions that are complex and entrenched but modifiable. Put simply, violence against women is preventable. So violence against women presents in a number of ways, and these are some of the ways, and there's lots of detail that you can obtain elsewhere, but we've got things such as intimate partner violence, including dating violence, sexual violence, whether it's perpetrated by someone known to the victim survivor or not, sexual harassment that can occur in workplaces, in public spaces, online, specific types of violence that are experienced primarily by communities of women and girls, and that could include things like dowry-related abuse, sexual and reproductive coercion, sex trafficking, and other slavery-like practices, and violence that can occur in institutional settings, for example, in aged care facilities, disability or residential care settings, and it can also include state-sanctioned or legalised violence. So this problem and phenomenon manifests itself in a range of ways in our community, and women and girls and children experience this in huge numbers. So there are distinct gender dynamics to violence in Australia, including differences in the prevalence and in the ways in which men and women perpetrate and experience violence. Because the field of research and practice on violence against women has historically focused on responding to this violence, most prevalence data and other research in the field is focused on victimisation or women's experiences of violence. And this evidence and information that we have is really critical to inform early intervention and response strategies to ensure that they respond effectively to women's experiences and needs. However, strategies to prevent violence against women, that is, to stop it from occurring in the first place, must focus on the perpetration of this violence, the characteristics of perpetrators, and the structures, norms, and practices that drive and enable its perpetration. So it's really important that we understand these dynamics in order to be able to address, respond, and prevent violence against women. There's also a strong and consistent association between gender inequality and levels of violence against women. There's also significant consensus in the international evidence that examining the ways in which gender relations are structured and the social context of gender inequality is key to understanding the underlying conditions that produce violence against women. Consistent factors relating to gender inequality predict the prevalence of intimate partner violence with significantly and consistently higher rates of violence against women in countries characterised by gender inequality and poor human rights protections. So where we have higher rates of gender inequality or those conditions, we often have higher rates of violence. So what is gender inequality and why is this such a big deal? So gender inequality is a social condition that's characterised by unequal value afforded to men and women and an unequal distribution of power, resources, and opportunity between them. It's the direct result of patriarchal systems which privilege the needs, interests, and behaviours of men over women, and which permeate many aspects of Australian society and institutions. Gender inequality is also created by heteronormativity and cis-normativity, that is, attitudes, norms, and behaviours that suggest that heterosexuality is the normal or preferred sexual orientation, and cisgender is the normal and preferred gender identity, which then have an impact on how people understand binary gender roles and gendered norms in society. So a lot of attempts over the years have tried to identify sort of simplistic or single factor causes for individual men's violence. And we know that that doesn't always tell the true story. These individualistic explanations often point to the psychology or mental health of the perpetrator, his life experiences, such as he's had an exposure to violence himself, or personal circumstances, he's unemployed and stressed, or his behaviour, he was using alcohol or other drugs. And they often will try and place these as explanations as to why this sort of behaviour and action occurs. And whilst these factors might be present in a given incident of violence, they don't really explain the pattern of men's violence because most men to whom they apply to are not violent. And because many women also experience these factors and they're not engaging in these types of behaviours and actions. To properly explain men's violence against women as a widespread social problem, we really need to apply a really deep and explicit social analysis. And the model presented here, which is contained in the Our Watch Change the Story framework, is around a socio-ecological model, which is, the concentric circles basically look at how all of these things sort of intersect and interact. So this model views violence against women as the outcome of interactions among many factors at many different levels: the individual and relationship level, the organisational and community level, the system and institutional level, and the societal level. And these factors, the interaction of these factors at different levels, are of equal importance, as well as the individual factors. So the gendered drivers then, what are these? They're the factors that most consistently predict this violence at a population level and explain its gendered patterns. Violence against women is not caused or determined by any single factor. But as the number of relevant factors and their degree of influence increases, so does the probability of violence against women. These factors are termed gendered drivers because they arise from gender discriminatory institutional, social and economic structures, social and cultural norms, and organisational, community, family, and relationship practices that together create environments in which women and men are not considered equal, and violence against women is both more likely to be tolerated and even condoned. And so the 4 drivers, as they're outlined there, are the things that individually or together in concert with one another reinforce the conditions that enable violence against women to occur. There's a range of reinforcing factors as well, which are often referred to. And I'm just going to show a little video from our watch around the Change the Story framework, which will explain some of this in easier language.
This is the story of a boy and a girl. It's a universal story and an Australian story. It's a story that occurs every 2 minutes, in fact. A story that happens 657 times a day, every day of the year, and in every kind of household and every city and region across Australia. This is the biggest story behind violence against women. This story doesn't have a happy ending, because this is the story of how gender inequality contributes to the murder of one Australian woman almost every week. Sounds like a tall tale, right? Let's take things back to the start. Here's the story of a regular woman. As a girl, she gets told how pretty she is, never how clever she is, that if she wears a short dress, she's asking for it. She grows up and gets used to being harassed by men on the street. That's just the way it is. Here's the story of a regular man. As a boy, he learns that women aren't equal to men from a very early age. Even though both his parents work, on the weekends, his mum does the housework while dad watches sport. When he cries about being bullied at school, his dad tells him to stop being such a girl and just punch him right back. Technically speaking, we'd say that these social norms, practices and structures have shaped both the boy and the girl, creating a society where women are valued less and men are expected to be dominant and in control. In such a world, disrespect and hostility is excused, and violence against women is far more likely. But back to our story. The girl grows up into a woman, the boy grows into a man, and they begin to date. He jokes that he hopes she doesn't get fat now that we're together. She's not sure whether she should laugh. They have the same education and do similar work, yet he earns more money. He's quickly promoted, like other men in the company, while she gets overlooked. At home, she does all the household chores, and he takes control of their joint finances, seeing as he's the main breadwinner and all. When they're at the pub, he puts her down in front of his mates. His friends stay quiet. In the morning, he wakes up and blames the alcohol. And stress, he always has an excuse. When she gets pregnant, her boss says she can't come back part-time. After the baby is born, the lack of flexible job opportunities and childcare keeps her out of the workforce. She is socially isolated and financially dependent on him. He controls decision-making, and her. They are not equals. She is dependent on him for everything. So she never tells anyone that he has started to hit her. She doesn't say anything to her family or friends. She grows more isolated. She has nothing else but him. So she lives with the violence until their story ends, one way or another. This story isn't a one-off. It's a story shared by 1 in 4 Australian women who have experienced physical or sexual violence from a current or former partner. And it's a story of 1 in 5 women since the age of 15 who experience sexual violence, including rape, 1 in 4 emotional violence, and 1 in 3 women physical violence. But it's also a story that affects children. More than half of the women who experienced violence had children in their care when the violence occurred. For victims and perpetrators, violence against women is the conclusion often reached after a life lived in a society where women and men aren't treated equally. But we, you and I, can change the narrative. Better education, policies, practices, support and funding can prevent this all too common story. When women and men have equal power, value, and opportunities in relationships and in society, violence against women is less likely. By nurturing caring, respectful, and equal relationships, and by creating equitable and inclusive communities, workplaces, and institutions, we can create a society of equality and respect. where violence against women is unthinkable. Let's change the story, because ending violence against women starts with gender equality.
So I hope that that gives some context to the issue that we're going to be talking about today, and that you have a greater understanding about what those drivers are and how we may be able to prevent this from happening. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Margaret. Well, you really did set the scene, and when I look at what you've presented and that Our Watch clip, it really reinforces that it is time to definitely change the story. So from Margaret, I'd now like to introduce Julie. Pronouns she, her, and Julie is the CEO of Annie North and the National Chair of WesNet, the Women's Services Network, the national peak body for domestic and family violence organisations across Australia. She is currently on the Victorian Family Violence Reform Advisory Group, Chair of the Loddon Family Violence Systems Leadership Committee, and Co-Deputy Chair of the Global Network of Women's Shelters. She was a member of the inaugural COAG Advisory Panel on Preventing Violence Against Women and Their Children, and has also regularly presented at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women on numerous issues on violence against women. Julie is passionate about ending gender-based violence against women and their children. She is an experienced practitioner, both working with women and children who've experienced violence and also with men who have used violence against family members. She has worked in the family violence sector for approximately 30 years, and in June 2021, she was awarded a Member of the Order of Australia for significant service to women and children experiencing family violence. Julie will be discussing consent and coercive control. So over to you, Julie.
Thanks, Kate. I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm meeting here on the land of the Jar and the Jar Jarrong people. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to pay my respects to any victim survivors who are present today. So anyone around in the 1960s or 70s would associate the personal as the political with the emboldened women's liberation movement. The rallying cry aimed to bridge the distinction between the gendered domains of private space, the home for women, and the public sphere for men. It also served to highlight the fundamental nature of the right to bodily autonomy, agency and self-determination. The right to make decisions over one's life and future, these are universal values. Without control over their own bodies and selves, women were far less likely to be able to access broader legal, political, social and economic rights. While reproductive rights spring immediately to mind, those relating to pregnancy and contraception, bodily autonomy encompasses a much broader suite of rights. Personal agency includes the right to marry a person of your choice, or the right to have control over your own earnings, or the right to decide freely when and with whom to have sex. Consent and how it is defined and defended goes to the heart of upholding women's rights. Laws have a role to play. Oh, Tina, could you put to the next slide, please? Sorry. Laws have a role to play in both leading and reflecting the social climate of the time. Sometimes they lead and create cultural change, enabling women into spaces from where they were previously excluded. Workplaces that once lawfully fired married women have, over time, become accommodating of workers' caring responsibilities. In other cases, laws lag. Criminalisation of rape in marriage in Australia began with South Australia in 1976, ending with the Northern Territory in 1994. In the context of sexual violence, the legal approach to consent is evolving over time, and similarly to the way rape in marriage was treated is at different stages in different parts of Australia. While the definition of consent varies from state to state, the emphasis has been on when consent is not given or not obtainable rather than when it is. Consent may be deemed to be absent if the victim survivor was asleep or unconscious. Complex considerations can exist around the accused's so-called honest belief. This is starting to change with the approach of affirmative consent. The affirmative consent model is intended to circumvent subjectivities associated with consideration of the perpetrator's beliefs and the victim's behaviour, which should never be considered. Tina, you have to shift to slide 2. Thanks. Until very recently, Tasmania was the only jurisdiction to put the onus on both parties to ensure the other is actively consenting. As many of you would be aware, the bravery of young activist and victim survivor Saxon Mullins has carried this issue into the public spotlight across the nation. 2 weeks ago, New South Wales became the front runner on the mainland, passing the Affirmative Consent Bill, which requires people to expressly say or do something to confirm their partner consents to a sexual activity. The law also affirms a person's right to withdraw consent at any point. It's made clear that if someone consents to one sexual act, it doesn't mean they've consented to other sexual acts. It clarifies that a defendant cannot rely on self-induced intoxication to show they were mistaken about consent. Victoria will be following suit shortly with the introduction of their own affirmative consent provisions foreshadowed for 2022. The Attorney-General, Jacqueline Symes, has said the changes will flip the system. Rather than focusing on the behaviour of victims, the perpetrator will need to describe actions taken to gain consent. And it's likely that other states will follow too. Queensland has already modernised some aspects of consent, including enabling its withdrawal. And the Queensland Women's Safety and Justice Task Force is examining whether further changes along an affirmative model are needed. And the ACT is currently reviewing its laws. While provisions vary within Australia, the range is wider internationally. Sweden, Portugal, Spain and Denmark are considered most aligned to the affirmative consent model. And Australia is largely on par with countries such as England, Wales, New Zealand and Canada. And according to an Amnesty report, only 12 of 31 European countries have a definition of rape that includes consent, with the others focusing on rape as by force or threat of force. Let's slide 3 now, please, Tina. Another dimension of consent that is currently receiving attention, again due largely to the activism of the women's sector and the determination of people such as Hannah Clark's parents, Sue and Lloyd Clark, is coercive control. Coercive control in the context of intimate partner relationships is a term developed by Professor Evan Stark, who defined it as a pattern of domination that includes tactics to isolate, degrade, exploit and control a person and frighten them or hurt them physically. It can include constant monitoring, isolation from friends and family, controlling access to money, controlling clothes and appearance, humiliation and constant put downs, threats and gaslighting. Coercive control is debilitating because it is so pervasive and insidious. And the fear of violence is the key to how coercive control works. Day by day, a person's rights are chipped away. The incremental advancement of coercion and control can be almost imperceptible to the person living with it day after day after day. A key strategy of the coercive controller is to normalise certain demands and behaviours. For example, it is normal to share passwords, normal for men to manage the finances, normal for him to be jealous, normal for him to not want her to go out in certain clothes, normal to ensure she doesn't talk to other men, normal that men can't control their sexual impulses. Good girlfriends tell their partners where they're going. Good girlfriends give in to sexual demands, and the consequences also tend to escalate over time. The erosion of rights, empowerment and agency makes it very difficult to identify the absence of consent. On its own, coercive control is not currently subject to criminal sanctions in most states and territories. Tasmania explicitly criminalises non-physical forms of family violence, such as economic abuse and emotional abuse or intimidation in their Family Violence Act. Coercive control is recognised in the Victorian Family Violence Protection Act, and bills have been introduced in New South Wales and South Australia. The Queensland Government will extensively consider the recommendations of the Women's Safety Task Force, calling for the criminalisation of coercive control. Earlier this year, a parliamentary committee recommended that federal and state governments develop shared principles to guide any criminalisation of coercive and controlling behaviour, with a view to ensuring consistency across the jurisdictions. And these principles are currently in development. The consultation process around the principles is raising some deeply held concerns around the criminalisation of coercive control. There are strong views that it could increase barriers for women who are already disadvantaged in accessing and navigating justice. Many First Nations women fear reporting their experiences of abuse and violence because of the ongoing social and cultural marginalisation, racism, and lack of culturally sensitive services. The extremely high rates of the removal of their children are a major disincentive to any engagement with the system. Disability advocates raised concerns that the pressure for carrying the burden of proof could become an adverse barrier for women with disability, especially for women with intellectual disabilities. LGBTIQ+ people also feel that the police, justice system and support services are not culturally safe. Refugee and migrant women may become targeted by their community if they involve the police. These communities make clear the limitations of the legal system, particularly for vulnerable groups of women. Biases are so deeply entrenched within the system and within the people within the system that the institutions and people entrusted to protect us can work instead to expose us to greater harm. Indigenous people are already over-policed. Police often misidentify the perpetrator and the victim. Victoria Police is currently working hard on training police to identify the predominant aggressor. There's no quick legal fix to solving violence against women. Without question, we want perpetrators to be held to account and we want justice for victim survivors. However, it is essential that the full consequences are explored with victim survivors from diverse backgrounds and that legal measures are not implemented in isolation from improving other parts of the system. Next slide, please, Tina. With the limitations of the legal system in full sight, and as it scrambles to keep up with emerging forms of violence against women, we need to be looking at all the levers we have available to try and affect change. One of these levers, and possibly the most important one of all, is embedding the concept of consent at the very earliest opportunity and at every available opportunity. In a recent article in The Age, Kerry Sackville likens disgraced cricket captain Tim Payne and his unsolicited dick pics he sent to a woman to a toddler having inexplicable pride in his penis. Men also weaponise their penises, and a dick pic becomes a malevolent reminder of men's capacity for sexual violence and women's fear of sexual violence, intended to make the recipient feel disrespected and powerless. Consent is willfully and deliberately ignored. Sackville concludes that dick pics are an inevitable consequence of male entitlement. Their entitlement blinds them to the need of consent. These men fail to see the impact on women and girls of receiving unsolicited dick pics. Not all expressions of male entitlement and ignorance of consent are sexual. Indeed, the foundations of consent are rooted in early childhood, long before the typical period of sexual activity. Children are routinely touched, often in kind ways, by grandparents, teachers, sports coaches, friends, parents, neighbours, and this can serve to blur the boundary between safe and unsafe touch and consent versus coercion. Children's bodies are often treated as the property of their parents or other adults. Helping children practice bodily autonomy is a critical starting point in the foundation of consent culture. It will help them understand the difference between appropriate and inappropriate touch. As a community, we need to start using the language of consent with children and between adults, and thinking about the concept of consent in all our day-to-day activities. Men particularly need to understand that touch is rarely benign or welcome. It is a rare instant that touch without consent would be appropriate in the case of a work colleague, acquaintance, or a stranger. Indeed, touch within relationships is not always innocuous or appreciated either. We know that some women feel particularly vulnerable to unwelcome touching, not just by men. Pregnant women speak regularly of pregnant tummies seemingly becoming public property. People with disabilities talk about being routinely handled with people taking charge of their mobility aids or touching or grabbing without consent. Consent is cornerstone not just to our approach to touching, sexual and non-sexual, but also in how we treat people's rights to bodily representation and privacy. Image-based abuse is one of the most insidious forms of violence against women, emerging as a major issue in the last decade. Intimate photographs are posted, uploaded, shared, and photoshopped. While largely unlawful, it is a minefield in terms of consent, when photos may have been taken consensually or shared between intimate partners. It becomes almost impossible to effectively withdraw the image from the public realm once it is out there. With children's access to phones and devices becoming an essential part of life and schooling, embedding consent education into early education settings once again becomes a critical intervention to address violence against women. Consent, bodily autonomy, agency and self-determination are the bedrock to human rights and should be part of the fabric in how we treat each other. An important element of agency and self-determination is having a voice. Part of having a voice is being believed. A recent report published by Anne Rose called "Chuck Her on the Lie Detector" found that as many as 4 in 10 Australians mistrust women's reports of sexual violence. 4 in 10. This represents a massive hurdle to delivering agency and justice to women. A key finding by Anne Rose was that the sexual consent script needs to be changed from one where responsibility is on the woman to say no to one where consent involves both parties respectfully, continually and mutually agreeing to sex. We've heard many wonderful young voices over the last year in Saxon Mullins, Brittany Higgins and Grace Tame, but as Saxon herself acknowledged, white able-bodied voices are more audible than those from First Nations women, women with disabilities, migrant and refugee women, older women, and people from the LGBTIQ community. While the broader public is starting to listen to some stories, it is important that more are heard. This is the road to understanding ways in which human rights breaches are experienced differently. It's the road also to assuring women have control over their own destinies, the ability to freely give or deny consent, and the space to speak and be heard. So if the personal is the political was the clarion call for the 70s, this year's Let Her Speak and Enough reflect our focus for the years ahead. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Julie. I find the personal is the political is what I'm hearing quite a lot this year. And I think, you know, it was powerful in the 70s and I think it needs to be re-owned for current generations as well. And I think part of setting the scene for today's conversation is about talking about what is coercive control and about consent, not just sexually, but across all aspects of our lives. So thank you for that. And I think now we're going to look a little bit more specifically into a regional project. And I'd like to introduce Rani, pronouns she, her, who is the Way Out Health Promotion Worker at Sunbury and Coburg Community Health. Rani has been in this role for the past 3 years and has worked more broadly in the health and community sector for the past 15. In her current role, Rani has been working both in the Preventing Violence Against Women space and in Way Out, a program that supports the rights, mental health and wellbeing of LGBTIQA+ young people. Rani is living and working from home on Dja Dja Wurrung country, and Rani will be presenting today on the findings from Sex Smart Youth, a survey conducted with young people in the Macedon Ranges.
Thanks for having me. I'll just share my screen. Is that okay? Everyone can see it? Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for having me. My name's Rani. I use she, her pronouns. And as Kate said, I'm presenting on the findings of the Sex Smart Youth survey in the Macedon Ranges and representing Sunbury and Coburg Community Health. So I'll just give you a little bit of a background to the survey. So myself and Sarah from Macedon Ranges Shire Council Youth Unit co-led the Sex Smart Youth Working Group, and we pulled that together after sitting on the Shout Working Party, where we implemented the My Town condom count in the Macedon Ranges. And following there, we were interested in seeing what more could be done around sexual and reproductive health needs for young people in the Macedon Ranges. So we pulled together this working group made up of organisations who were working with young people or who had an interest in this topic area, so including Women's Health Loddon Valley, several neighbourhood houses, Thorpe Harbour Country, a local secondary school, and Macedon Ranges Health Youth Unit. But most importantly, we didn't want to continue without having youth representation on our working group. So we have these lovely 2 paid youth participants who sat on the Sex Smart Youth Working Group, Kate and Alex. Unfortunately, neither of them could present with me today, but they did make such a great contribution to the work of the working group. So we were able to secure some funding through Sunbury and Coburg Community Health and the Shire Council to fund Kate and Alex. And I'm happy to share, I guess, our EOI process and I guess the evaluation model and tools if anyone's interested, getting in touch with me after the webinar. So the primary action of the working group was to, I guess, find out what we needed to know. So we developed a Sex Smart Youth survey to gather information from 12 to 25-year-olds who lived, worked or played in the Macedon Ranges. And we wanted to know, I guess, what people knew, what they didn't know, and what they wanted to know more about. So we had a survey subgroup made up of myself and Sarah and the 2 youth participants to design the survey based, I guess, both on some national surveys that were already in operation and also including questions that were pertinent to the needs of the working group members. So this allowed a really good opportunity for the youth engagement. We obviously got feedback from the broader working group and then also feedback from SERSH. And from there, we did some capacity building with the young people to pilot the survey with a group of other young people. I think there was 10 that they piloted with, and this was invaluable because we realised that, you know, some of the terms that we assumed that young people would know, such as GP, contraception, HIV, they didn't know the definitions. So we were able to include definitions within our survey and reword some of the questions in response to the feedback given by the pilot group. So the survey was distributed over the month of March in 2021 across the Macedon Ranges. And we had a communications plan that covered, you know, engaging local secondary schools, a social media campaign, printed media outlets, and Win News Television. We're very pleased to get 250 responses to that survey from young people, and only 20 of those were ineligible. We were really keen to get secondary schools on board in engaging students with the survey, and so we worked, I guess, with schools to suggest different ways they could engage students and the ways that we, as a working group, we could support that. There was varying levels of engagement from secondary schools, from some not wanting to engage with it at all because they were had reservations about the content. Some shared on their social media channels and through their internal, I guess, student communication networks, and others we had some champion teachers who took the survey on board and completed it with whole class levels or programs. So that's where we got the biggest buy-in, which was really great, having those champions. But we really, we acknowledge that, you know, students and schools were impacted by survey fatigue after the 2020 lockdown period, which had also impacted on our timelines of rolling the survey out. So you can see up here that we've got some of the demographics data. So around 2/3 of respondents identified as female, around 1/3 identified as male, 3% identified as gender diverse, and 17% identified as not heterosexual. The biggest age cohort that we got who responded to the survey was that 16 to 17-year-old age bracket, making up to close to half of total respondents, and 84% of them found out about the survey through school. So just really reinforced, I guess, you know, reinforced the importance of engaging schools. And we want to acknowledge that, you know, secondary schools or all schools have got lots of competing demands, and that can make it difficult, but it was really valuable having them on board. In terms of the most trusted sources of sexual and reproductive health info, you can see the top most trusted source identified was parents and carers, followed by friends, and then followed by GPs. Close to a quarter of respondents did have issues accessing sexual and reproductive health info or referrals or services during COVID-19 though. In terms of information sources never used by respondents, you can see there that it's 64% said youth workers, 61% school nurse, 58% said counsellor, and I can't see the screen because I'm covered by the chat board, but what the next one is teachers, I think. And I guess we don't We didn't ask why they didn't use these services, but I guess as a group we hypothesised around this, and the youth participants talked about potential embarrassment and perceived stigma about going to the school nurse about sexual and reproductive health needs, worrying about whether their friends would ask why they'd gone to see the school nurse. They also talked about a lack of awareness of what you could actually go and see the school nurse about. And so highlighted that there could be some awareness raising within secondary schools about the breadth of issues that you can actually go to your school nurse and your school counsellor for. And they also talked about potentially feeling embarrassed or not going to see teachers about sexual and reproductive health issues. So the reason that we've been invited to speak here today was because of the, I guess, the most important topics relating to sexual and reproductive health as, I guess, identified in this survey by respondents of the survey. And they were sexual assault was rated as the most important, followed by consent, free and voluntary agreement, and followed by consent, ages of consent and the law. So what I guess throughout the survey, the respondents really identified a lack of education around sexual assault and consent. And there was a talk about the need and a want for more conversation and education around this in the school system. So there are some quotes up here on the screen, but I will read out some more of the quotes from young people so you have an opportunity to hear, I guess, hear from the voices of the young people. But I will mention that the quotes that we've got are all from female identifying respondents, but saying that male identifying respondents and gender diverse respondents also rated sexual assault and consent as their most important issues. So here's a quote from respondent number 1. I feel like in my experience learning this topic at school, they kind of talk about the extremes of sexual assault, which is still only very briefly touched on. I also feel like this and the focus on only speaking about this to the girls has led to a lot of misconceptions, and particularly with the boys, horrible language around sexual assault, insensitive things, and then when people call them up, they just say it's a joke. So respondent 2, I want to learn about how to be sexually safe when in an LGBTQ+ relationship. Respondent number 3, I think sexual education in Macedon Ranges seriously needs to be changed. Gender identity and sexual orientation, as well as consent and sexual harassment and assault, should take a larger part in our education, as women are still experiencing high levels of sexual harassment and sexism, and many of the people in the Macedon Ranges are not accepting or have an understanding of the LGBTI+ community. And I'll just read one final quote. I think sexual assault really needs to be discussed in our community. All genders need to understand exactly why these things still happen and take it seriously. Every time a program or someone comes into the school, they get mocked and then no one takes it seriously. The things I hear in the hallways at school is disgusting, homophobic, ableist and racist slurs, and it genuinely makes me uncomfortable, and I don't want to be around or involved with the kids who say it. I'm sick of the way us feminine people get treated at school. It's something needs to be done. So you can hear that there's some really strong feelings around sexual assault and consent, and really wanting to get more education around that. So we know that this isn't isolated to the Macedon Ranges though. Looking at the 2018 National Survey of Secondary Students and Sexual Health, which we based some of our survey questions on, just over a quarter responded yes to the question, have you ever had unwanted sex? Female students were more likely to answer yes than males, and the survey acknowledged that there was too small a sample size for statistical differences for trans and gender diverse students. The most common reason that people answered yes to this was that they had pressure from their partner, so a lack of consent. The Victorian Student Representative Council 2020 Congress report, one of the issues they identified was that current sex education in schools does not include modern and inclusive content, and that young people need to understand their rights and responsibilities to be able to make informed decisions about their health and relationships. And so their vision is that all students feel safe and comfortable during sex education, and that their curriculum allows them to be break down social stigma and that no student is excluded. Also looking outwards, so as I said, the survey was open during March 2021. And so during a previous presentation that Kate, one of the youth participants, and myself presented at, we were asked why we thought there might have been such an importance placed upon sexual assault and consent as topics of interest. So we talked about, I guess, the increased consciousness raising during that time. While we know, as is mentioned already in this webinar, this is not a new fight. This has been going on for a long time. But during early part of this year, there was a heightened level of reporting in the media in the months of January to March 2021, and this was leading up and during the Sex Smart Youth Survey being open. So with increased media attention, political debate and public discussion comes increased conscious raising and often personal realizations about, you know, our own experiences of giving or not giving consent and surviving sexual assault. So some examples I've got up here on the screen are in January 2021, Grace Tame was awarded Australian of the Year for her advocacy around survivors of sexual assault and with a specific focus on institutional settings. In February, former Liberal Party staffer Brittany Higgins went public with her allegations that she was raped in a colleague's office. This sparked a national discussion about sexual harassment and assault in politics. Also during that time, and I guess in response to it, there was some youth movements, such as Chanel Qantas's Instagram survey. So Chanel put an Instagram poll up, asking, have you or anyone you know been sexually assaulted by someone you went to school with? She's received a really overwhelming response within 24 hours, and this has just continued. And she started a campaign calling for better and earlier education about sexual assault and consent in schools. So I just checked that petition last week, and since February, it's received 34,000 signatures and over 6,000 testimonies. And then right in the middle of our survey being open, some of you probably were there was a March for Justice. Tens of thousands of people around the country were marching together to express their anger and frustration at continued high rates of gender-based violence, both in the government and the community more broadly. So, and protesting against the lack of government action and response to the Australian Human Rights Commission's Respect at Work report and the poor handling of allegations of sexual assault in Parliament. So there was a lot going on, and I think, it makes people think about their own experiences and those of people around them. So what we've done with the data from the Sex Smart Youth Survey is that we fed it back to the schools in our area with an infographic, but also with which included suggested teaching resources that they could use with their students to respond to the data, acknowledging that we got such a strong response from young people who heard about the survey from their local school. So some of the resources we highlighted were It's Time to Talk video, which I won't go into because I know it's being presented next, which is great. We highlighted respectful relationships curriculum because anecdotally we've heard that that was potentially more difficult to teach during the remote learning periods and has taken a bit of a back seat. So highlighting the importance of having that front and centre of our education. We showcased Thorn Harbour Country, who have got safe and affirming sexual and reproductive health workshops for LGBTIQA plus young people called Health Smarts, and also highlighted the Be Proud of Your Choices campaign. How am I going for time, Tina?
You're pretty close to the
end. Okay, so we've shared it with our data with other relevant projects, including the 16 Days of Activism campaign, and working group members will be using the data from the Sex Smart Youth Survey to inform our own individual work. So that's it for me, and yeah, thanks for listening, and happy to answer some questions later on if you have any.
Thank you so much, Rani, and I think there was so much data and information in that presentation, and I think one of the interesting things is that 25% of young people, and it was women in your survey, spoke to the fact that they'd had unwanted sex. And I think that's probably a statistic that has not changed for a very long time. But it's a really lovely segue to Alex. who is a she, her, and is the team leader for children, youth and families at CASA CV, and provides counselling, advocacy and support for child and adolescent survivors of sexual abuse, children who are engaging in problematic sexual behaviours, along with their families and the broader community agencies who support them. Alex has over 20 years experience working therapeutically with adolescents across a wide range of service areas. Alex loves witnessing young people's incredible strengths and is passionate about supporting young people discover their purpose and potential, which also keeps her young at heart. Alex will be presenting today on consent education and how consent education may be improved, and also will present the Time to Talk video that Rani mentioned and school program guide. So over to you, Alex.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. And good afternoon, everyone. It is a joy to be here. I'd just like to say that I'm presenting today from Dja Dja Wurrung country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. A trigger warning, I will be talking about content that can be triggering, such as sex and sexual violence and pornography. So please look after yourself. Feel free to put me on mute, step away from your screen and look after yourself and seek support if needed. I'll also be using some gendered language, acknowledging that sexual assault is often gendered, with 95% of the perpetrators reportedly being male, but not forgetting that victim survivors can be of any gender, but are usually women and children. Now, I'll just make sure that here we are. Great. So CASA CV, Centre Against Sexual Assault, Central Victoria is one of 15 CASAs throughout Victoria. We are a not-for-profit government-funded organisation that provides trauma-informed counselling, advocacy and support for people who've experienced a recent or historical sexual assault. We provide a service from a multidisciplinary centre where we are co-located with Socket, which is the Victoria Police, Child Protection, the Victims of Crime Service, the Bendigo Community Health Service, and next year, the Open Circle Restorative Justice Program, which we're very excited about. We work from an intersectional, feminist and victim rights framework, which acknowledges all forms of sexual assault as an abuse of power. And for people who've experienced a recent sexual assault, we provide after-hours crisis care, and our counselling is provided on a one-on-one basis or in groups. But we also deliver a family-focused program called Refocus for children and young people up to the age of 18 who have engaged in harmful sexualised behaviours. We also provide professional consultations to our community and professional training, research partnerships and a PhD program, student placements and advocacy. So as you can see, we're quite busy. So what is the problem with consent and why does it matter? Well, the high demand for our service is a damning testimony to both the drivers of violence against women and how reticent our society and our government has been in addressing these, which has resulted in a recent acknowledgement of the importance of consent education. And while I don't believe that young people can rely on consent education as being the only solution, although without it, young people are relying on peers, the internet, movies, porn, and a sprinkling of parental input, which at times can be unhelpful and exacerbating. But consent education can be seen as one part in a range of skills that can provide early prevention against the need for our service. And I would surely welcome the day that we can close our doors due to a lack of demand. But until then, how common is sexual violence in our society? Well, sadly, it's very common. We have one sexual assault that is reported every hour in Australia. 1 in 5 women, 1 in 20 men have experienced sexual assault in their lifetime. Young women are especially vulnerable to violence, particularly in dating relationships, with those abused before the age of 15 have an increased vulnerability for future victimisation. And young women who are between the age of 15 and 19 report the highest rates of sexual assault of any range and any sex group. We also have noticed an increase for young boys who've experienced sexual assault. And unfortunately, there's really low reported rates to police, and that assault and sexual violence is perpetrated by someone known and trusted. And it has significant impacts, which costs, I think, around $21 billion to Australian society. So shown here is, as previously shown, in an ecological framework that kind of displays how factors at the individual level collate at the family, community and societal levels that influence and compound the drivers of sexual violence. These factors create environments that inform young people's ideas, perceptions and experiences who are at a life stage when their values and gender expressions are being formed. So values of respect, equality and non-violence and a more flexible understanding of gender roles, relationships and identities are important foundations for forming respectful non-violent relationships, both in the present and in later in life. And exposure to cultures that support violence against women and gender inequality may work against these foundations being built. So how does that affect the current context for our young people? Well, children and young people use social media sites to seek out relationships and information on sex and sexual identity. Young people are accessing pornography at a younger age, and I'll talk more about that later. And women and gender relations are often portrayed in media in highly stereotypical ways. And children first learn about consent through interactions in their own home. They observe how boundaries are communicated, respected or disregarded in everyday situations. And as children grow into adolescence, these talks deepen to incorporate sexual and intimate relationships. And it can be confusing to navigate their own and other people's desires, pressures and expectations. So what do we know about young people's attitudes? Well, young people, a lot of young men don't understand that controlling behaviours in relationships are a problem, with many young people believe that having control is a normal part of a relationship, with nearly a quarter of young people disagree that violence against women is common. 1 in 7 young people believe that women often make false allegations of sexual assault, as we've previously heard. 1 in 8 are not aware that non-consensual sex in marriage is a criminal offence. 1 in 4 believe that if a woman sends a nude image to her partner, then she's partly responsible if he shares it without her permission. 1 in 6 agree that since women are so sexual in public, it is not surprising that some men think they can touch women without permission. And 1 in 4 young people agree with the statements that when a man is very sexually aroused, he may not even realise that the woman doesn't want to have sex, and that rape results from men not being able to control the need for sex. Young people have very limited personal experience to draw on to navigate gender roles, identities and relationships. And being closely bound to family and peers, they may have access to fewer countervailing influences. And as a result, young people may be especially vulnerable to adopting the heavily gendered scripts promoted through peer and popular cultures such as the media. And then we have sexting. So sexting is now a relatively common experience for young people, and as we know, is associated with some problematic outcomes, with 50% of young people indicating in a recent survey that the last time they received a sext, it was unexpected or unwelcome, with women twice as likely as men to receive unwelcome sexts. And there's variations between genders around the motivations for sexting. And as we know, the importance of providing support for young people who are experiencing problematic sexting is really important to help them become more assertive when sexting arises in interpersonal relationships and to navigate this really tricky space. And then we've got pornography. And of course, we know our young people are now able to access so much more than a centrefold, with 92% of boys and 62% of girls have seen pornography by the time they're 13. And in a recent Australian study, it was reported that 95% of males and half of females have viewed pornography at least monthly in the last 12 months. And it's for a range of purposes. But however, most mainstream pornography shows really significant levels of violence, sexual hostility and racism, with 97% of women being the targets of aggression and with men being mostly the perpetrators of this aggression. Mainstream pornography also includes themes of domination, objectification, degradation, gendered aggression, and inequality. And most commonly, young female performers are more likely to express a pleasured response to visible aggression. Pornography also rarely depicts the negotiation of consent, relational intimacy, or safe sex. And sexual media, we know, influences young people's attitudes, their behaviours, their expectations, and their sexual scripts. And early exposure to pornography predicts a more sexualised, sexually objectifying, and stereotypic gender views of women, teen dating violence, and harmful sexual behaviours. And to minimise these harms, we need both regulation and education to support young people to critically evaluate and respond to porn's influence, and equip them for relationships and sexuality that is safe, respectful, mutually pleasurable, and consenting. So we know that young women report the highest levels of sexual assault, and for many this occurs within the context of their first intimate relationships where coercion plays a large role. And it's been found that among young adult men who've engaged in harmful sexual behaviours, half did so for the first time before reaching the age of 20. And without intervention, behaviours may persist and escalate. So what's needed? Well, I believe that consent education must be in line with the new affirmative consent legislation that's previously been discussed. There must be a demonstrated commitment to implement respectful relationships and consent education as much as possible within many structures in our society, particularly in schools, because preventing sexual violence is everybody's business. And so sexuality education that is an active and continuing consent model is much more in line with recent legislation, with the affirmative consent model, meaning the focus is on the accused person confirming that they have received consent rather than scrutinising the behaviour of the victim survivor, which is a welcome change. So acknowledging our society's growth in understanding trauma, there is a new recognition that role that trauma responses play in our ability to give or withdraw consent. And as such, we're beginning to move away from the outdated fear-based traditional sex education of no means no, as it's not always possible to verbalise a no, and inching towards a model where we focus on the yes means yes, a sex-positive approach where we seek enthusiastic consent as a benchmark for engaging in sexual activity that is based around pleasure. So what information that we believe needs to be common for children and young people? Consent education should challenge and correct the common misconceptions about sexual violence and challenge the heteronormative gender concepts and sexual scripts that normalise intimate sexual violence as a natural or exaggerated expression of innate male sexuality. It should be tailored to reach all and be inclusive, and also strengthen young people's ability to communicate, navigate and respond effectively to romantic requests and pressures within romantic relationships and peer relationships, alongside navigating the use of alcohol and substances. And also needs to target really key developmental and transition points to maximise positive social and sexual development in our young people. And because this approach acknowledges that sexual assault is a possible endpoint in a continuum of unwanted and unwelcome power-based behaviours that young people encounter. We believe that programs need to support responsible, positive, pleasurable sexual development and teach non-violent communication and problem-solving skills, including assertiveness training, choice-making, personal rights and responsibility. Should support informed and responsible choices about sharing intensely personal thoughts, opinions or images, including the ways that they can manage sexting, and communicate concepts with parents, promoting parental connection and helping parents to know how to talk with young people about safe sex and relationships and be able to model these in their own. So I would say that in order for all of this to occur, We need to make sure that all school staff are trained and have an understanding of family violence, sexual violence, and responding to disclosures in a trauma-sensitive way. We need to utilise our trained peer educators to deliver content to young people. And we also need to deliver consent education in small groups, single-gendered sessions, and mixed-gender groups when appropriate. We also, best practice would be to deliver multiple sessions of short, no longer than 50 minutes and over successive years. And we also need to measure the program impact to make sure that we are meeting our young people's needs. So now I'm going to show you a video that has been created. I'll just get down the information about said video. It's what we call the Youth Ambassadors Clip. It's made as a collaboration between the Macedon Ranges Shire Council, as Rani mentioned earlier, and the Youth Ambassadors Program at NCASA CV in 2019. There's also a school's guide to using the video within the Respectful Relationships Program, and that's available through us and the Macedon Ranges and has been supplied to the Respectful Relationship Coordinators in the Education Department. Now I'm just going to press play and cross my fingers and toes.
The first way
to stop sexual assault from happening
is to know what it is.
I want to talk to you today about something we don't really talk about much, and we should.
I don't want to talk about this.
It's embarrassing.
So, what's the problem?
1 in 20 men
and 1 in 5 women will experience sexual assault in their life.
That's over 2 million people in Australia.
That's a lot of people.
What is sexual assault? What does this even mean?
If you are forced, intimidated, or tricked into a sexual act without your consent or against your will, this is sexual assault.
The perpetrator can be a family member,
a friend,
someone from work, school, church,
or a stranger, but it's usually someone you know.
This includes unwanted kissing and touching,
sexually degrading insults,
or unwanted exposure to pornography.
Okay, so that's all pretty full on.
That's why we need to talk about this.
So, where does sexual assault start?
By not having consent.
What is consent?
Consent is when you agree to sexual intimacy of your own free will.
Saying yes to one thing
doesn't mean saying yes to everything. Your ability to consent is affected by your age. You cannot consent to sex if you're under 12.
If you're 12 to 15, you can only consent to sex if the other person is within 24 months of your age.
If you are 16 or 17, you can't have sex with someone who is in a position of authority or power over you.
Consent is about always checking in. Consent has to be received.
Saying yes to a kiss is not saying yes to anything else.
Check in.
Consent can be withdrawn at any time.
Withdrawing consent can sound like,
that hurts.
Please stop.
I'm not sure about this.
I want to go home.
Or maybe they're not saying anything at all.
Silence is not consent.
And you can't consent if you're asleep or unconscious.
Or if you're so drunk or under the influence of drugs that you can't either agree or say no.
Asking for consent sounds like,
are you okay?
Is this okay?
Do you mind if I...
Are we both enjoying this?
So get clear ways to check in with each other.
And just keep talking.
Myth busted 1.
It only happens to women. Although more likely for women and children, it can happen to anyone.
Because it doesn't always just happen between people of different genders.
And it can be between people of the same gender identity.
So, it's between any sexual orientation,
age, or cultural background.
Mythbuster 2.
If your body responds, then you must want it.
Unwanted sexual arousal and physiological responses can occur during rape or sexual offences, but doesn't in any way indicate that the person consents to the sexual activity.
Mythbuster 3.
Guys always want to have sex.
Some people love having lots of sex, and some people don't, regardless of their gender.
Shaming and pressuring people into having sex,
when they might not want to,
is negative for everyone involved.
Mythbuster 4.
They were asking for it.
Because they let me buy them a drink?
Because she was wearing that dress.
Because he got in my car.
No, it's sexual assault if you haven't asked for or received consent. Mythbuster 5.
Rape jokes are funny.
No, they're not.
Rape is violence.
Rape is a hateful act.
There is nothing funny about rape.
Mythbuster 6.
People lie about being raped all the time. The rate of false allegations of sexual assault is actually really low.
A range of studies suggest only 5% of rape allegations are considered false.
However, rape is a notoriously underreported crime in Australia.
Mythbuster 7.
Most sexual assaults are committed by strangers.
8 out of 10 victims of sexual assault are assaulted by someone they know, often in a familiar residential location. Mythbuster 8.
Sexual assault is only rape.
It can be any unwanted sexual act.
Mythbuster 9.
But they were drunk. It's never okay, no matter what state you're in.
Mythbuster 10.
They should take it as a compliment.
A compliment is supposed to make you feel good.
Sexual assault is about controlling and violating another person.
Not about showing someone you care.
If you or someone you know has been,
Might have been.
Impacted by sexual assault,
There are places to go for support.
You can call the Centre Against Sexual Assault helpline. There is also SOCIT, the Sexual Offences and Child Abuse Investigation Unit, or talk to a trusted adult or school counsellor.
There are services and support out there, and it's time to talk.
things can go wrong.
Know why.
Know what to do if it happens.
You can talk to a trusted adult.
Look out for your friends.
Consent is everything.
Be good to each other.
And let's keep talking about it.
Now, I'm just going to, so wasn't that absolutely wonderful? Let's see if I can just, there we go. Nope, excuse me a moment. Just come right down about the bottom here. There we go. So, wasn't that such a wonderful video and lovely to hear from the words of our young people? Makes it so accessible and real, I think. I guess I'd just like to conclude today just because to say that since the rise of the Me Too movement, a powerful movement has grown demanding action to prevent sexual violence and to support people who experience it. A call to action to improve the community's knowledge about sexual violence was made repeatedly in the recent VLRG inquiry. And we hear this call, it's a momentum that should be harnessed. And as has happened with family violence, the Victorian Government and all schools should commit to educating the community about sexual violence. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. I just think what a great presentation, and also It's Time to Talk is a fabulous video. And I think we can really confidently say it didn't cost millions of dollars, unlike the milkshake campaign that went nowhere and conveyed no really positive message for anyone. We have some time now for some conversation, and I think what I'm really going to do is actually ask the panel for their shared ideas about what is the most appropriate mechanism for consent and sex education, both in schools and targeting the community, that we think can be implemented. And I think, you know, we can only talk in the Victorian context at the moment for what we know. We've got respectful relationships, but how do we actually mitigate or work with the barriers or concern about having consent taught in schools?
Kate, it's Margaret. Centre for Nonviolence used to have a program in schools called Solving the Jigsaw, which was really focused on creating a culture of safety, changing the culture of violence that exists in our communities. And inevitably, some of the content that was that engaged young people, I guess, around these conversations was pretty confronting. And we often had to deal with resistance, not only from school personnel, but also parents. I think there really needs to be some concurrent, when we're doing these types of programs and initiatives, particularly in schools, there needs to be really strong and concurrent campaigns, messaging, and also engaging adults around how to have these conversations, and the fact that they are challenging. They're challenging no matter, what your belief systems. They're not easy to have. And because often what happens is that the presenters of school programs are then on their own, so we actually need to have really strong community messaging. We need to make sure it's like having all your ducks in a row. It's about making sure that we've got the appropriate legislative responses that back up. And I know in the context of talking about family violence and intimate partner violence, how much easier, it's still difficult, but how much easier it's been made through having appropriate legislative and social policy that's sort of backing you up and reinforcing. So I think that there needs to be that sort of whole community push to enable these conversations to be given a fair chance within the environment of the school or the community, wherever it may be.
Thanks, Margaret. I think the government has committed to a 10-year sexual assault strategy, which I'm hoping will be that push. But I'm wondering, Rani talked about that in her survey, the young people would first go to a parent or carer for information. And I'm wondering, how do we reconcile parents being prepared to have those conversations with young people? Because I think there's a gap in that from what I've seen today. So I'm really curious about what is our advice to parents or program for parents. And that's to anyone on the panel who wants to jump in.
I don't know if there is actually a specific program that is delivered by Respect for Relationships for parents and carers. I know that programs such as School Focus Youth Services often organise parent webinars on the basis of the needs of that community. But, and please jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there's a standardised kind of program to get parents on boards to support them with those conversations as well. But we do know that is, it's really effective to have parents on board and brought in on those conversations when we're delivering the content to their children.
Thanks, Rani. Did anyone else want to have a go at answering that question? No?
I was just thinking that because talking about consent can be really difficult, particularly if a parent has their own lived experience. So I think acknowledging that can be really helpful. And, there is still a lot of shame in our society about sexual behaviour and what's appropriate and what's not. And I think that it will take quite a lot of support for families and parents to feel comfortable to have the other talk. But I think it's really possible, and there are some really great information and support out there for parents.
Yeah. All right. I'm aware of the time, and I guess we've heard a lot of data today and discussion about the norms of the culture and society we're living in. If there was anything, if you could wave a wand, what would be the thing you would change that would have the most impact around addressing gender inequality and the rates of violence against women predominantly?
I can see you've picked an easy question, Kate. I think, I think if we go back to some of the content that I presented, which looked at, those spheres of influence in people's lives, and I don't think there is. This is the sort of the reason why it is such a complex and wicked problem, I guess, if we use some of the speak in the industry, is that we need to be working on a whole lot of levels. And our advocates, our schools, young people, we can't do it without those system and structural changes that support change in our community. And it's interesting, if you look at the you know, how certain things in our community, once upon a time, we used to, you know, not wear seatbelts. So, you know, we had a law change, which, you know, there was the, you're not going to tell me I have to wear a seatbelt type brigade. But over time, our behaviour change was forced initially by the legislative change, and then it became very undesirable because the community then sort of they came to understand why it was necessary from a public safety point of view and a public health point of view. So you need to have things working from a number of different levels. And if we're to change, we actually need to address all of those spheres of influence and look at the opportunities to influence those and change the structures that actually contribute to gender inequality and that leads to violence as well.
Thanks, Margaret, for a really good comprehensive answer to a question that sounded quite flippant. But we did have a question from the panel earlier, and from not from the panel, from the chat, and it talked about the affirmative consent model informing consent education in school, but also what opportunities are there to re-educate older generations about affirmative consent. And I'm thinking, you know, the consent education that we're talking about is for younger people, but it does go across multiple generations. So is there a different way we package that?
I would say we could repackage that. You know, it's, as we know, our children are often parents' greatest teachers, but parents need to have all of those kind of similar skills to negotiate the difficulties and know how to communicate and how to manage their own feelings, their own shame, their own fears for their children as they're able to understand this kind of new world that young people are engaged in. So I think anything that helps and provides good skills for parents to feel more comfortable and to be able to communicate in a really positive way with their children would be really helpful.
And I'd like to add too, that I think it's really critically important for young parents when they're bringing up their children before they even start school, and around, you know, go give grandpa a hug type of thing, you know, and a lot of education focused on young parents would be absolutely fantastic. I think there's a really big gap on re-educating older people, and I think about my own father and my own grandfather, and how they thought it was a compliment to touch a woman or to tell her how good she looked, or, you know, and we see those same people now going into hospitals and aged cares and sexually assaulting nurses who are predominantly female. You know, so I think there's a bit of a gap there that we should have already been onto, and it's going to be unwelcome by many of them. It's like there's been such a huge cultural shift, and you can see it happening. And but what concerns me is the Anne Rose research, where there's an increase in young people not believing, particularly women who say they've been sexually assaulted. And that I'd urge people to go and try and read that, chuck it on the lie detector report, because it's quite disturbing. There's a trend of not believing the facts. They were informed of the statistics around the National Community Attitude Survey and the Australian Bureau of Statistics Personal Safety Survey, but they actually didn't believe them, even though it's extremely rigorous research. And I think that's a bit of a broader issue. You know, there's an increasing amount of people disbelieving science and medical experts around vaccinations and so forth. So I think it's one to watch. And the research shows that there's a disbelief in it being gendered. So we've got to keep the information and education up around the gendered nature of it as well. So it's big challenges.
I think it is big challenges, and I'm really conscious of time, and I think that's a good point to end on. I think we could potentially look at another consent forum, and it would be great to involve some young people in that forum and look at diverse population groups as well. So what I would really like to do is thank the people who've joined us today for coming along. And we have now put an evaluation survey into the chat for people to fill out, and we'd really like you to complete the poll to tell us what you enjoyed about today or what you'd like more of. So on that note, I would really like to thank Margaret, Julie, Rani and Alex for your presentations today. They were really informative and covered a whole spectrum of what the consortium is passionate about and trying to achieve. I'd also like to thank the Auslan interpreters, Nick and Esther, for being here today. And I also really thank Tina and the Women's Health Loddon Mallee team for organising and supporting the event, and also all the other staff that participated from all of our partner agencies. So thank you all very much. And we will see you at hopefully future events that the consortium presents throughout 2022. So thank you very much.